it's all pre-taped.
Hi, Diane Kresh, host of Live from Diane's Living Room. We're not actually live, but we are local. And we're delighted to host Holly Karapetkova today, who is Arlington's brand new poet laureate. So welcome, Holly, and tell me a little bit about being the poet laureate and how that feels in a time of COVID.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's definitely an interesting time to be in any public position. I have to say I'm really grateful to live in a county that has a poet laureate position. The arts are such an incredibly important part of our communities. And in many ways, I feel that they're a public good and should be available and accessible to everyone in our communities. And when our government gives support to positions like a poet laureate or, supports artists in any way, they're really making it possible for those artists to do what they do and to give something to the public. So I'm grateful that there is a poet laureate in Arlington. And of course, I'm thrilled to be representing poetry in the literary arts right now, even in this difficult time. I actually think it's a time when we need the arts more than ever.
Right. They help us heal.
They do.
Our motto is when the going gets tough, the tough get arty. So
good. Yeah, I like that.
We have found that it's really kind of opened us up as librarians and people responsible for, in many ways, health and welfare of the community, that it's really spawned quite a bit of innovation. So I had the pleasure of working with Catherine Young quite a bit.
Right.
She was your predecessor as the poet laureate, and she came out, I believe, with an anthology. Maybe it's not yet been published, but an anthology of Arlington poets, which I've seen a number of excerpts from. It's a remarkable piece of work. Tell me a little bit about what you plan to do during your tenure.
So yeah, that book is actually coming out in the fall. It should be soon. And we're going to have some kind of event. We hope to have a face-to-face launch for the anthology as soon as it's safe to do so, but we plan to have some kind of events surrounding that anthology. And Kate Young is a fantastic poet. She's a fantastic community organizer, and she did a wonderful job laying the groundwork for me as the second poet laureate. So I'm really grateful for her, the way that she took on this role, and for her putting together that anthology, which took a tremendous amount of time and energy, and it really is a wonderful representation of our county. And so yes, there will certainly be some events surrounding that anthology. I'm currently working with Dan Brady and some other folks in the county on visual, I forget the name of it now, I should have looked this up before our interview, but a visual representation of poetry. We're going to be broadcasting poetry visually on the sides of buildings.
Great.
With local artist Josh Bell, and the poetry is going to be some of my poetry, some other poet laureates. We're soliciting our national poet laureate, our state laureate. And so we're really excited about that project. That's going to be fantastic. And it should launch later in the fall.
She featured a lot of poetry during National Poetry Month, which is April, as you know. And I was just knocked out by most of what I read, and happily a couple of acquaintances of mine that I know through other associations were actually represented. So that was kind of a neat thing. Another reminder that it's a very small world and we're 6 degrees of separation, blah, blah, blah. So I want to talk a little bit about your poetry for a few minutes.
Sure.
Delighted to say that we have both of your works in the library. It's part of our Arlington Authors collection, and I've been spending quite a bit of time with Towline, and I really like it. What are some of the themes, the influences? What feels right to you when you're communicating and writing poetry?
So that book has a lot of themes about immigration. My husband's a political refugee and an immigrant, and many of my close friends are immigrants. It also has a strong thread of me dealing with the death of a very close friend of mine.
Yes.
Who died an untimely death of cancer. He was a very dear childhood friend. And so for me, writing many of the poems in that book were my way of working through the grief, and also trying to connect with other people who have felt a similar kind of grief. So I'm a big advocate of writing to heal ourselves. And there's a lot of really interesting research about how effective it is. Poetry and the literary arts are really very accessible. They're easy for anyone to do. You don't have to be a professor to be a writer, and you don't need any special equipment or materials. You can just write.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, and it's also a really healthy way for us to process emotions and get out our rage, our grief, things that we might otherwise channel more negatively.
So let's talk about poetry for a second. When I grew up, reading poetry amounted to memorize this poem and stand up in front of the class and recite Robert Frost or something. And as I grew older, I became a little bit more interested. I was at one time married to a poet who's now deceased. When I mention poetry to people, though, there's still this, oh, poetry's hard. I don't really get it. I don't understand it. And when you get that reaction, and maybe you do, or maybe you don't.
Oh, I do.
Okay, so when you get that reaction, how do you respond and get people kind of over that intimidating hurdle?
Absolutely. I'm actually a big fan of the memorize a poem idea. My son had to do that, and I was either first or second grade in one of his classes, and I loved it. It was really wonderful for him. I think, you know, I get a lot of students, you know, coming to college, and Marymount's a really diverse community. We have a lot of first generation college students, a lot of students who maybe don't feel comfortable in the sort of academic setting. And yeah, they have been made to feel intimidated by poetry. And I think our education system in general does a disservice to poetry and literature, because it's something, and I believe that analyzing poetry, analyzing literature is a wonderful skill, and it's something we should cultivate. But a lot of times it takes the joy out of a poem. Billy Collins has this wonderful poem, like you beat the poem with a rubber hose to get its meaning out. And I think a lot of students have been made to feel that way about poetry. It's this kind of mystery language, and you need the secret key to unlock the secret box, and the magical meaning will pop out. And, you know, and you're just not smart enough because you don't get that magical meaning.
Right.
And, you know, the truth about poetry is that it's more than anything an emotional experience.
Right.
And even if you don't get all of the logic in a poem, it can move you emotionally, and you can connect with it. And that's why I love the idea of memorizing poems, because when you memorize a poem, you internalize it, you take it into your body, it becomes part of you. And, you know, even if you don't understand all the words, although by memorizing a poem, you spend a lot of time with the language, you pretty much figure out what it's saying. But even if you don't, it becomes emotionally a part of you. And you realize that to enjoy a poem, you don't necessarily, I mean, poems don't always logically make sense. You don't have to understand everything that's going on.
Well, I think that's an important point. And Billy Collins, speaking of, I worked many, many years at the Library of Congress. He was the poetry consultant, now called the Poet Laureate. There have been a cavalcade of stars in that position, Rita Dove and Gwendolyn Brooks, et cetera. But he established something called, I think, the Poem a Day.
Yeah.
And Robert Pinsky was another poetry. And through their joint efforts, I think they were trying to make poetry more accessible. Who's still doing that kind of work, if not in an academic setting?
Oh, I think pretty much every contemporary poet is doing that kind of work, and poets out in the community. And one thing I would say is that while my students are intimidated by poetry in an academic sense, many times they're on YouTube watching spoken word poets. Many times they are writers, they are performers, they're performing poetry. So they're intimidated by poetry in a certain setting, but not by poetry the way it appears in communities and the way it sort of naturally emerges in spoken word and that kind of tradition. So to me, poetry is the most democratic of art forms. It has oral roots. It's meant to be for the people. And I believe everyone can be a poet. Everyone should be a poet. If you want to write poetry, you go for it. You don't have to have a special degree. You don't have to have special training. Yeah. And so I run into a lot of students who, like, they write poetry secretly. They may not want to tell everybody because it's really private and personal. They're terrified to death of, like, being in an English class and having to analyze a poem, but they're off writing poetry and listening to other people do poetry. And So they're experiencing poetry in a much healthier way, I guess, or, you know, much more appropriate way.
Right.
They just don't know how to deal with it in the classroom.
Right. Yeah, well, there seems to be this mystique around poetry, capital P, in an academic environment, Robert Lowell, people like that. And then there's poetry that's happening all the time, as you pointed out, on YouTube, et cetera. Were you always a writer? Did you start journaling and writing at an early age? Did you come to it later? What was your
Oh,
transition?
I did. I wrote a lot of bad poems in middle school.
Everybody.
I was very unhappy in middle school, you know, as most intelligent people are. You know, you're trying to find your way.
Sure.
I was always awkward and introverted. So, you know, I had friends, but I always felt like an outcast. And so I wrote poems about it. And I learned at a very early age to use poetry to channel some of what I was feeling and to deal with it. And so, yeah, I've been a writer for a long time. I didn't become really serious about writing until later. I was always encouraged by my very practical parents to have a real job. You know, I was really good at science and math, so I was an engineering major for a few years. And I was just going to write poetry for fun on the side, like William Carlos Williams.
Right.
And have a real career.
A real job.
And at some point I was like, you know, why? I mean, I can be an English major and I have a lot of possibilities. Maybe I'll never make a living writing poetry, but I at least can be serious about it and take myself seriously. And so it was sometime in my undergraduate degree and shortly after that I changed my major to English, and I decided that it's what I loved and I would find a way to do it. And for me, the path was grad school and PhD, and I like school. It was never an issue for me. You know, I love going to school. So I was like, oh, why not? And then teaching at the university level, which is a way that you can continue writing. You have some time built into your schedule for writing.
Sure.
And teaching is a natural connection too.
Yeah. And we're talking about getting a real job. I think Wallace Stevens was actually an insurance salesperson.
Yes. Oh, yes, he was. He was indeed.
Celebrated poet by night. So I would like you, please, to share some of your poems with us.
Absolutely.
I always make it dealer's choice, so it can be
okay.
from your prior collections or new work. But I was thinking if you could read 2 or 3 poems, it's always
Absolutely.
a thrill for us to hear the words from the author, him or herself. So I turn it over to you at this point.
Great. Awesome. Well, I'm going to read a poem or 2 from my current manuscript project. It's called Still Life with White. And it's about the sort of my struggle with racism and white supremacy. And it's a glaring critique of white supremacy. I grew up in a really diverse environment. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia in the 80s. So it was a really interesting time. And I was surrounded by a variety of different views, racism, but also anti-racism. And so it's just something I've grappled with for many years. And this first poem is called There Is Only Now, and it has an epigraph. We are told to accept what is happening to us because of ancestors' wrongdoing, but it is all based on historical lies, exaggerations, and myths. And this is from Dylan Roof, the young man who killed all the people in Charleston, South Carolina, in the church. My parents live in Charleston, South Carolina now, so it really touched me to the core. Nothing happened. I was there. I was not there. The body swung like a pitchfork. The bodies hung like lanterns from the bridge. Their mouths were stuffed with rags. This never happens. This still happens every time I cross the bridge. Black bodies swaying above the water, white bodies crowding on the bridge, looking down to see. Am I more afraid of a corpse or my shadow? My shadow or my hands, the blind spot, the rope pulling, and those white bodies looking down, their faces blurred against the background like ghosts. And I forgot to mention, it also comes from my interaction with a wonderful website called Without Sanctuary, which is a collection of lynching photographs and postcards.
Wow.
Collected by the uncle of a woman I went to graduate school with, in fact. It's a really powerful site.
Well, what you just read was very emotionally charged, and certainly the imagery. I've noticed that with it's kind of a constant. Your imagery is so visceral. Like I can feel the experience that you're trying to share as you're working through the grief. I ended up actually with Towline reading a number of the poems about your friend and his death from cancer, and so I don't want to go on and on, but that is, well, it speaks for itself. Would you like to read some more, please?
Yeah, I'll read one more from this collection. And this one's called We Thought We Were. And it has a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who he has this wonderful refrain in his book, Between the World and Me, that people who thought they were white, right? And the epigraph is, Americans believe in the reality of race as a defined, indubitable feature of the natural world. Mouthwash in the medicine cabinet, toilet paper quilted, quiet on the streets after dark. Crickets, the only sound, combing the block, the blades of their legs sharp, our straight hair combed straight down our backs, or pinioned into pigtails. Nothing piggish about us, our pink skin, paper cuts staunched with gauze, 2 cars in every garage, garbage placed on the curb. We have kept our hands clean, upper crust, cream of the crop. We were seasons siphoned off and sipped through a straw. A held breath, natural law.
Mm. This is part of a forthcoming collection, both of these?
Yeah, it's called Still Life with White. It's in circulation now. Hopefully we'll find a home
right
soon.
How many poems comprise the collection?
It's about 60 pages of poetry, and it's difficult subject matter, and it's sensitive. You know, anytime white people try to speak about race, which I firmly believe is absolutely necessary. We invented racism. We're the ones who uphold the structures that enable racism and white supremacy. And I believe we have to, as white people, have conversations and start trying to dismantle it.
I will say, with respect to challenging racism in general, that the county is about to take on a series of community conversations about racism led by people of both white and black, but it's with a consultant to talk about some of these issues. And I'm hopeful that by having difficult conversations, we can become stronger as a community, but also get over some of the hurdles of being intimidated by the topic or fearful of the topic, because we don't want to be offensive. So we end up not talking about it at all, but because we don't talk about it, we don't correct systemic racism. So,
absolutely. Yeah, it's a really complex, you know, the book White Fragility talks about the ways white people don't address racism or, you know, stop the conversation on racism. So it's really complex, the ways that white people avoid it. I do think sometimes it is good-natured. I think people are afraid of making the situation worse or saying the wrong thing.
Right.
But I agree, like we have to be forgiving a little bit with each other and try to start some of these conversations and realize that everybody's a different path in their journey towards anti-racism. And I think we have to be generous. I try to do that with my students. It's tricky having those conversations in the classroom.
Oh, I can imagine. I can imagine. Yeah. And there's so much going on anyway with Black Lives Matter and people's opinions about that, and protests and police actions, and it's a national election where all of this is unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, front and center. So it's really complicated, but I do agree that not talking about it is not the answer. So I applaud your willingness to confront it, and I hope you find a publisher. And even if you don't find a publisher right away, we would love to do a Zoom reading with you.
Oh, great.
And share that with the Arlington community. So offline, we can talk a little bit about that.
Wonderful.
Would you like to read another poem or two?
Yeah, I'll read one from Towline, which, like I said, has deals a lot with issues of immigration. And this one is based on a number of dear friends, Bulgarians, who I know who live here in America. And it's called Immigrant. Forget Hollywood. Private homes the size of theaters, swimming pools scooped into every backyard, inalienable rights. If you visit those houses, it will be to mop vast expanses of marble floors or blow leaves from the pool deck. Forget blonde girls who live there, shining like small suns against a blue sky. Surfer boys with more muscles than all the village combined. Forget the village. Its dust will never choke you again, kicking down the dull roads leading home to your parents. Forget your parents. This is easy. You send them $200 a month, enough for a year, instead of answers to their questions about the grandkids. Forget the grandkids, your children, who refuse to speak to you in their native tongue and laugh at the way you say sheet, which sounds like shit. They have no idea who you were. Forget who you were. Doctor, actress, teacher, saint, someone with a name no one here can pronounce. That old life itching like a phantom limb or lost city. Even when you save up enough cash and vacation days to make the trip back, it isn't where you left it.
Oh, that's terrific.
And I can read one more if you'd like, because some of the poems about immigration are actually based on my experiences with my students as well. I have a lot of students who are immigrants.
Right.
And I have a lot of students who are undocumented. And one of my most wonderful students, who is now teaching ESL in Alexandria.
Oh, terrific.
Walked here from Guatemala when he was 13.
Gosh.
And so this is a poem that I wrote for him, and it's called Song of the Exiles. There never was a garden, only a leaving, miles and miles of footprints in the dirt. In the beginning, the shattered sun, the wind, and nothing left but our shadows sifting through the dust behind us. When we turned, we did not turn to salt. When we turned, there was nothing behind us to burn, nothing to return to, though who could blame us for turning, with only the long days ahead, tongues tripping in the dirt. They said we didn't belong. They blamed us for leaving the garden, which never was or would be. Where could we go, we who had come from nowhere, and hence could not return?
Mm.
And I'm really attuned to the conversation about immigration that's happening.
I was going to say, I mean, it's, well, you've chosen some very challenging topics with the racism and the white privilege and immigration and chasing the American dream, but we keep shutting the doors and making it more and more difficult for people to be part of our, you know, our country. And so we could talk about these things all day.
I know.
Before we ended, I'm always curious, who were the writers who really stood out for you as you developed your own craft and your own voice? Favorite writers, either fiction or poetry or both?
Yeah, well, I was very actually traditionally educated. I mean, I went to college at a time when you didn't read much diversity. Mm-hmm. And even my grad school education was fairly traditional. So and I still kind of have a soft spot for T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats and they have had a huge, even Shakespeare, they've all had a huge influence on my writing, I know. But as soon as I got out of grad school, I remember this like incredible sigh of relief. I was like, oh my gosh, I can read whatever I want now. I can write whatever I want. I don't have to play by anyone else's rules. And I immediately started reading almost only women. Mm-hmm. And then at some point I started reading almost only writers of color. Mm-hmm. And I think it was me trying to come to terms with some of my own racism and my own history and my whiteness. And I just remember this kind of interesting moment of realization, like racism is like all these writers can think about. It's all they can write about. Mm-hmm. Why do I, as a white person who lives in the same society, why am I not even aware of that? Right. As an issue, right? And it was a really a wonderful awakening moment for me. Well, horrific, but also, for my growth and development as a human being, it was a wonderful moment of realization. Sure. And writers like June Jordan and sorry, Audre Lorde was one of my
Oh,
favorites.
right,
Lucille Clifton, I love Lucille
right,
Clifton. So those are some of the early influences. Nikki Giovanni. Um,
right.
I remember coming into contact with Natasha Trethewey's work. I
Sure,
actually met her at in one of my grad school programs, and I was so excited by the way that she went back to interrogate history in
right.
her work. And so that was an early inspiration to me. Um, Now I read almost all local writers. I really love the DC literary scene. It's an awesome place to be a writer. It's a really friendly and encouraging, supportive environment. And so I read a lot of local writers, a lot of people I know. And also I still, it's very important to me to continue to read writers of color.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah,
Yeah, a friend of mine is Jose Padua, and he won.
yes.
Do you know Jose?
I don't know him personally, but I know his work.
Well, I sort of grew up with him a little bit because he and his brother, older brother, and I were in college at the same time. And Jose and his wife Heather have been writers forever. And
Mhm.
Jose did quite well about a year ago with believe a Billy Collins Prize. But he writes in a conversational way that I really admire, and his blog posts often have photographs. And there's a lot about identity. His family is Filipino, and
Mhm.
coming to terms with that. And it's beautiful writing. So it's interesting that well, again, small world. So
Yeah.
terrific. So as we close, I hope you will keep us in mind for either a reading or something where we can help support you and your work, and the kind of voice that you're bringing to all of us as we grapple with COVID, which will still be with us for a while, I'm afraid. And this was a delightful conversation. And please, don't be a stranger. We would love to be in touch more often and support your work, and applaud what you're doing with your students and to help us heal. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.